Here's what's really happening in your child's brain when they overcome a challenge. Challenges in children engage a part of the brain that is right behind the forehead. It's called the prefrontal cortex. And that part of the brain is responsible for all sorts of things. And if you have watched any of the videos on my channel, you have likely heard me talk about the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functions. Those executive functions are things like decision making and critical thinking. If children are just always having things done for them, then the connection to the prefrontal cortex doesn't have an ability to develop. And let me explain. That prefrontal cortex is there, and it is somewhat connected in a child's brain, but it doesn't really form a strong connection until age 12, and that full connection doesn't develop until age 25. That is why still college students and people right out of college are still making decisions that make people my age and older, and people older than me are looking at me saying the same thing. But we look and we're like, oh my goodness, what were you thinking? And really, they weren't. That part of the brain wasn't fully connected. That decision-making, critical thinking part of the brain wasn't fully connected. Now, in order to connect that part of the brain, it has to be through practice. The way that part of the brain comes online fully isn't just by time. It comes on faster and stronger when it's allowed to be pressed, when it's allowed to be required. If you think of it kind of like if you don't use it, you lose it kind of thing. If you don't use it, it never has the ability to develop. So allowing children to go through things that force them to develop decision-making and critical thinking skills, like overcoming and bouncing back after challenges, those things require the brain to assess problems, evaluate options, and choose solutions, which builds mental flexibility. If you work with children, you know that flexibility can be very difficult for kids. It's one of the reasons why them not getting their way is so hard for them. It's not that they're trying to be little punks. It's that flexibility is hard because flexibility is a lot to do with that prefrontal cortex. So if you force children to develop some of those skills, it's not to say that they're going to be able to develop all these skills at age 8. There is a limit because of that connection that is not fully taken place just yet. But the more you allow them to face developmentally appropriate, that's the word, developmentally appropriate. I guess it's 2 words, but let me say them again. Developmentally appropriate challenges. It builds that connection. If you are asking something of a child that is just impossible for them, or they are unable to meet the expectation, it does not create that connection. But if you are pushing them to be just one step farther than where they may be comfortable, or a few steps farther than where they may be comfortable, it forces the brain to build more connection. When it's something that's way out of their reach, like sitting still and being quiet for 7 hours a day at school, that is not something we should be asking children to do. It's not something that's going to build a pathway. But if it's, hey, for the next 45 minutes, here's what we're going to do, and then we're going to take a break. That's going to be hard. It's going to be uncomfortable, but it pushes the brain to build some of that problem-solving development. It builds some of that connection to the prefrontal cortex. And then each time a child successfully handles a challenge, their brain reinforces that neural connection, that connection, especially to the prefrontal cortex, that helps regulate emotions and process decisions. There are all sorts of chemicals in the brain, but there are some chemicals that when they get released in the brain, it reinforces that was a good thing. There's one chemical that's called dopamine. So when a child overcomes a challenge, there is a large amount of dopamine that gets released into their brain. Dopamine is a reward chemical. It helps kids feel good. It helps you feel good. It helps us all feel good. If you have felt positive and proud of something, it is because your brain has released some dopamine. Well, that dopamine is a reinforcer. It is saying, do that again. Yes, that was good. I liked that. Do that again. So when you allow a child to successfully handle a challenge, that connection is being built and some dopamine will get released to tell the brain to do that same thing again. And as they learn to do that, then more dopamine is getting released. And over time, that connection becomes very strong and they're able to regulate their emotions and process some decisions. Over time, not just immediately, but over time and consistency, those pathways can become stronger. And those pathways to the prefrontal cortex are what make it easier for a child to self-regulate and tackle future problems more independently. Without experiencing the challenges, the brain misses those opportunities to practice those vital skills of problem solving and decision making and emotional regulation and persistence. All of those things are prefrontal cortex level abilities. And it's not something we should just expect children to get right away. It's something we are going to have to allow them time and persistence and consistency in facing those things time and 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 time again, over and 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 over. And over time, they'll get to do it better and better and better until that connection is really strong. If you don't allow the child to face a challenge, they can't learn to bounce back from it. They can't learn to keep going through it. And that connection to that prefrontal cortex will be much weaker than if you had allowed them to go through it and struggle. That connection is a struggle, and allow them to struggle and allow that pathway to struggle to make its way. And then that neural pathway is reinforced from the dopamine that comes from feeling proud after overcoming the thing. And over time, it gets stronger and stronger and stronger. And that is the science of resilience. It's not just this behavioral thing. It's something that kids have to develop because of that connection to the prefrontal cortex. So the way to develop that the best is to allow kids to face developmentally appropriate challenges. And as they go through those things, those pathways are reinforced, and those pathways are the things that lead to greater ability to tolerate and regulate and decision make and problem solve. And as they do that, that resilience grows because they see not only they can do it, but it feels really great when they do. If you find that as fascinating as I did, make sure that you like this video and follow and subscribe to the channel for more science-backed parenting insights.